First of all, this story happened fairly recently. I was told that it took place around May. After leaving the military, this guy briefly returned to university before leaving for a working holiday abroad. He spent about a year overseas and eventually came back to Korea. But by the time he returned, the timing didn't line up with the next semester, so he couldn't immediately go back to school. He was in his final year, and since all of his friends had already graduated, he ended up living alone in a small studio apartment in a provincial city. While waiting for the next semester to begin, he supported himself by working part-time jobs. After work, there wasn't really anything to do. He had no friends around, so he eventually joined a certain social media platform. He spent his free time liking posts he was interested in and occasionally reposting them. Because of that, he started receiving a lot of direct messages from accounts that were obviously romance scams. But he was so bored that he actually started having fun with it. He would chat with the scammers and pretend to be completely fooled. He would keep the conversation going, act as if he was genuinely falling for everything they said, and then, at the end, he would simply say something like, "Thanks for the conversation," and then block them. He enjoyed messing with them. But then, one day, a woman approached him who seemed completely different from the usual romance scammers. She started talking about the exact same interests he had. At first, he thought, okay, this is probably just another romance scam. She's probably trying to build a sense of familiarity. So he started talking to her with that assumption in mind. But this woman was completely different from the scammers he had encountered before. By that point, he had already built up quite a bit of experience recognizing romance scams. He had his own mental database of how they usually talked, how they built trust, and how the conversations typically progressed. But this woman was the complete opposite. Instead of rushing into emotional manipulation or asking for money, she spoke naturally. She kept the conversation going for a long time, responding in a way that felt surprisingly normal and genuinely interested in what he had to say. According to what he was told, she was currently living in a small rural town in Japan. She said that she was planning to come to Korea soon through a short-term exchange program run by a language institute at a certain university. She would be staying in Korea for about 1 or 2 months. As soon as he heard that, he thought, here we go, another romance scam. But then she mentioned the exact location she was going to and even gave specific details about the program. So he started thinking, wait, is this actually real? He went directly to the university's website and looked into it himself. And the program actually existed. There really were exchange programs where Japanese students and Korean students traveled back and forth between the two countries. As they continued talking about it, she suddenly sent him a selfie first. She sent it to him and said something like, "Look, Dolby, I'm really going to Korea." It was almost as if she was trying to prove it to him. "See, I'm actually going." At that point, Dolby still wondered if the picture might have been AI generated. AI technology had already become so advanced that he couldn't completely rule it out. But the picture looked incredibly realistic. There were no obvious signs that it had been edited or fabricated. So even then, Dolby kept a small doubt in the back of his mind. It's probably still a romance scam. This is probably all a lie. But then she actually arrived at Incheon International Airport, and she kept sending him pictures as she traveled toward the city where she was supposed to stay. The route she was taking matched the journey she had described. Everything seemed to be happening exactly as she had said it would. And little by little, Dolby began to think, wait, maybe she's not like the scammers I've dealt with before. Maybe she really is just a foreign girl who happens to share the same interests as me. Eventually, the Japanese girl, I'll call her Sakura, asked him something. She said, "Would it be possible for us to meet somewhere in the city? If it's not too far from where you live, I'd really like to meet you." Dolby had told Sakura that he lived in Seoul, but in reality, he lived in a city not far from the place she was going to stay. So naturally, he started thinking, if she's actually real, maybe I should meet her at least once. By that point, they had already been talking for about a month. Nothing strange had happened. Their conversations had been completely normal. They had simply been talking like two people getting to know each other as friends. Even though he still had some doubts, he also genuinely wanted to meet her. So he suggested meeting in a very busy area of the city. He said, "Let's meet somewhere really crowded, somewhere in the busiest part of the city." And then he added, "Since you've just arrived in Korea, I'll treat you to something good to eat." In reality, Dolby was the one who suggested paying. Part of the reason was that he was still suspicious. He was worried that Sakura might somehow try to lure him to a specific location, so, in a way, he was trying to maintain some control over the situation. He thought that if he paid for everything himself, at least he wouldn't have to worry about being pressured into going somewhere because someone else had paid for him. So they made plans to meet in a busy part of the city, somewhere with plenty of people around, and have a meal together. Dolby headed there with mixed feelings. He still wasn't completely sure whether Sakura was real. But then he saw her. It was really the same Sakura he had seen in all those pictures. She looked at him and said, "Hi." And in that moment, that was it. All of Dolby's remaining suspicion disappeared. He thought, wow, I might actually have a chance at an international relationship. From that point on, he completely let his guard down. He and Sakura went on what was, by all appearances, a completely normal date. Even while they were dating, Dolby never noticed anything particularly strange about her. There was only one thing that stood out. Sakura belonged to a certain religion, and whenever it was time for her prayers, she would say, "I have a religious practice I need to follow during this time. I have to pray." She would sit alone at a desk and pray. Whenever the designated time came, an alarm would go off, and she would stop whatever she was doing and pray. This continued throughout their relationship. At first, Dolby thought they would probably meet just once and never see each other again. But after meeting her in person, he realized that she was exactly his type, and even while they were together, she would always stop everything and pray at those specific times. So naturally, he asked her, "What religion do you follow?" And Sakura simply explained, "Oh, it's a traditional folk religion from my country. Japan has many different religions, and there are quite a few small minority religions as well." She explained it as part of Japanese religious culture, and over the nearly 2 months she spent in Korea, the two of them gradually became a couple. From the outside, they looked like a completely normal couple. The only thing that seemed unusual was how strictly Sakura followed her prayer schedule. She was almost obsessively consistent about it. She prayed once at 4 a.m., then again at 1 p.m., and once more at 8 p.m. But because she always prayed in Japanese, Dolby had absolutely no idea what she was actually saying. Still, she was his girlfriend. She never tried to force her religion on him, and Dolby himself was actually quite negative toward religion. His mother had once been involved with what he considered a cult, so he had always tried to stay away from religion in general. But Sakura never pressured him to believe in anything. She simply seemed to be following her own deeply held religious beliefs. So Dolby thought, well, she's probably not involved in some kind of cult. Maybe she's just a very devout person. Eventually, the 3-month program came to an end, and Sakura's time in Korea was coming to an end as well. She was going to have to return to Japan. Then, one day, Sakura asked him, "Would you like to come visit my country with me?" At the time, Dolby was taking a leave of absence from university. He was also working part-time and had managed to save some money. So he thought, sure, I can probably afford a 3-night, 4-day trip. And the two of them decided to travel to Japan together. When Dolby arrived in Japan, he expected to visit the kinds of places most tourists usually go to. You know, the big cities like Tokyo or Kyoto. But instead, Sakura took him away from the city. They took a train for about an hour and 50 minutes, and even after traveling for an hour and 50 minutes by train, they still had to take a bus for another 40 minutes. Eventually, they arrived at a truly tiny rural village. Now, because this is a horror story, I'm sure many of you listening are already thinking, something is wrong. But from Dolby's point of view at the time, he simply thought, so she really did come from a small rural village. As he looked out at the Japanese scenery, the kind of scenery we usually only see in Japanese dramas, he continued deeper and deeper into the countryside. When they finally arrived at the village, Sakura explained, I live with my parents, so it would be difficult for me to bring a guest home. But there's only one inn in our village. I think it would be better if you stayed there for now. Then she added, Our village has its own traditional folk religion. There's a shrine here. People who enter our village are supposed to pray for their safety while they're visiting. We should go together and pray. But it's already too late today. I need to go home and greet my family, and you must be tired too. So why don't you get some rest tonight? We can go there tomorrow afternoon. Dolby was actually very grateful. By the time they had traveled all the way from Japan to this remote village, it was already around 6 or 7 in the evening. So Dolby said, Okay, then I'll walk you home and come back to the inn afterward. But Sakura immediately stopped him. No, it's okay. My parents don't know that you've come. I want to surprise them, so you go ahead and rest. I'll go home by myself. And so Sakura went home. Dolby went to the inn. But even on the way there, something felt strange. It was only 6 or 7 in the evening. And yet, why was the village so empty? Why was there nobody around? There wasn't a single person in sight. The inn itself was the only 2-story building in the entire village. Every other building seemed to be just 1 story. On the way to the inn, Dolby noticed a small shop. You know, the kind of old-fashioned neighborhood store you sometimes see in Japanese anime. There wasn't even a convenience store, just this little old-fashioned shop. Dolby thought, well, I've come all the way to Japan. I might as well buy a beer and have a drink. So he went inside. The elderly woman running the shop looked at him and immediately started speaking rapidly in Japanese. But although Dolby had a Japanese girlfriend, he couldn't actually speak Japanese himself. Since he couldn't speak Japanese very well, he could only say things like Kankokujin, Kankokujin, Watashi, Kankokujin. Basically, he was trying to say, I'm Korean. Then he tried to communicate using a few simple words. Buru, buru, beer. But the elderly woman simply took out what he wanted and gestured for him to leave. She shook her head as if to say, No, you don't have to pay, just go. Even though he felt a little uncomfortable accepting it for free, he said, Arigato, and quietly left some money behind before walking away. At the time, Dolby thought, wow, maybe this is just a really kind village. Maybe because there aren't many tourists here, everyone is especially friendly. With that thought, he continued to the inn. But when he arrived, something else was strange. The people at the inn already seemed to know he was coming. The moment they saw him, they looked at him and said something like, Kankokujin, as if they were asking, You're the Korean guest, right? So when Dolby said something like, Oh, Doshit, Kankokujin, he couldn't understand everything they were saying, but he could hear the name Sakura mixed into the conversation. So he thought, she must have made the reservation in advance. This must be the place she was talking about. He went upstairs, and there it was. The room looked exactly like something out of a Japanese movie. A traditional ryokan room, beautifully arranged and ready for him. From the outside, the building looked old and somewhat run down. But inside, everything was clean and well maintained. Still, Dolby was alone in a remote rural village. And honestly, even if nothing seemed wrong, being alone in a place like that could make anyone feel a little uneasy. So he opened a beer and went to bed early. And strangely enough, he slept incredibly well. He didn't experience sleep paralysis. He didn't feel uncomfortable. He didn't wake up feeling strange. He simply slept deeply and woke up feeling completely refreshed. When he woke up, he saw that Sakura had sent him a message. I'll come pick you up around noon. Then we'll go to the shrine together, pray, and do some sightseeing around the area. Dolby replied, Okay, I'll wait for you. And so, at around 12:30 p.m., Sakura finally arrived at the ryokan to pick him up. They then headed up toward the shrine. Those of you who have traveled to Japan probably know what I mean. When you visit a Japanese shrine, there is usually a large wooden gate at the entrance, and once you pass through it, you reach the area where people come to pray. But something immediately seemed strange. there was a large red wooden gate, and hanging beside it was a piece of cloth divided into black and white. Now normally, when we see black, we might think it has something to do with mourning or remembering someone who has passed away, and white might be associated with something sacred or perhaps a joyful occasion. But seeing black and white together was unusual. Dolby thought, "What is this? This place is really unique. Japan has so many different religions and traditions, so maybe this is just something specific to this village." They walked past the area where people normally pray. Then Sakura opened a door further inside and walked in. Dolby immediately asked, "Wait, Sakura, are you allowed to go in there? Shouldn't I just pray out here? Aren't visitors not supposed to go inside?" But Sakura replied, "Oh, it's okay. The person who manages this shrine is my father's younger brother. He's my uncle, so it's perfectly fine for me to go inside. Our family actually prays in here, very close to the shrine itself." And she walked inside. Inside was exactly what you would expect to see in a Japanese movie. A large tatami room, and hanging directly in front of them was an enormous traditional Japanese bow. People who have watched Japanese dramas or anime may have seen something like this before. Unlike the traditional bows we see in Korean palaces, Japanese bows can be enormous, sometimes nearly as tall as a person. There was a massive Japanese bow hanging on the wall. Beneath it was what looked like an altar, with the distinctive incense commonly used in Japanese religious rituals burning in front of it. And right there, directly in front of the altar, Sakura knelt down and began to pray. After Sakura finished praying, she said, "Come sit next to me. Since you came all the way here today, you should pray too. Pray that you'll be able to travel safely and return home safely. Close your eyes and pray sincerely." He didn't have a religion himself, but he thought, this is part of her culture. It's her friend's culture. So he closed his eyes and began to pray. And the moment he did, Sakura, who was sitting to his left, suddenly felt an intense pain shoot through his left thigh. He immediately opened his eyes in shock. Sakura was glaring at him with a terrifying expression, and somehow she had pulled out an arrow from somewhere and driven it into Dolby's thigh. As she stabbed him, she said something rapidly in Japanese. Dolby only understood 2 words, Gaisenjin, Yoshi. Those were the only 2 words he could make out. Now, it's important to mention that Dolby had been boxing for many years. So even though he was shocked and in excruciating pain from suddenly being stabbed, something immediately felt wrong. His instincts kicked in. He swung at Sakura's face as hard as he could, but even if you stab someone in the thigh with an arrow, it's not as simple as it looks in the movies. A human thigh is not something an arrow can easily just pierce straight through. In fact, when you try to stab someone with an arrowhead, your hand can easily slip, which can cause serious injury to the person holding it. It doesn't necessarily just drive straight into the body like it does in a movie. Still, the sharp object had pierced his thigh, and he was bleeding heavily. And in that moment, all kinds of terrifying thoughts began racing through Dolby's mind. What if there was some kind of drug on the arrow? And the way Sakura was acting now, she was clearly not normal. He realized one thing. If I don't get out of here right now, I might not survive. So he hit Sakura again. As she tried to get back up, he struck her one more time. Then he ran. But he knew that if he simply escaped and left everything behind, no one might believe what had happened to him, and he could still be in danger. So somehow he grabbed the arrow and ran. He started running, but before long, his left leg began to give out. He didn't know whether it was because of the blood loss, the pain, the shock, or perhaps something that had been applied to the arrow. Whatever the reason, moving his left leg had suddenly become incredibly difficult. But he knew he had to get away. He ran toward the exit, only to find that the door was locked. Fortunately, it was an old shrine, and the door was secured with a simple wooden latch, the kind that could be locked from the outside. So he kicked the door with his injured leg and threw his entire body against it. The latch broke. But even as he pushed his way out, he thought, if someone locked this from the outside, then there could be someone waiting out there. He burst outside. Fortunately, no one was there. For a moment, he thought about turning back and running along the path he had taken to get there, but then another thought crossed his mind. What if Sakura's accomplices are waiting along that route? So instead of going back the way he had come, he ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the shrine grounds. Even though he was limping badly, he forced himself to run as fast as he could. He pushed through what looked like a bamboo grove, and if you've ever been through a bamboo forest, you know how quickly bamboo shoots can grow up through the ground. With his leg already badly injured, he was rushing through the grove so desperately that he ended up injuring his ankle as well. Now his entire left leg was in terrible condition, but he kept going. He told himself, if I can just make it over there, maybe they won't be able to see me. So he pushed his way between the bamboo and hid deep inside the grove. While he was hiding there, he suddenly heard voices coming from somewhere below. A woman was shouting something that echoed through the forest. Iko, 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 Iko. At least, that's what it sounded like to him. Amid the shouting and the commotion, the only word he could clearly make out was, Doko, Doko. Later, he learned that Doko means, where are you? As the voices grew louder, Dolby suddenly began to lose consciousness. He didn't know whether it was from the blood loss, the shock, or possibly something that had been on the arrow. His vision began to fade, and just before he passed out, he thought, this is it. I'm going to die here. Then everything went black. But fortunately, he opened his eyes again. He was still in the same place. They hadn't found him. He immediately checked his phone, and of course, this had to happen at the worst possible moment. His battery was almost dead. Anyone who has traveled abroad knows this. When you're using roaming, your phone can drain incredibly fast. It was around 8 o'clock, and his phone had only 8% battery left. He knew he had to escape, but he also knew that if he went back into the village, he would almost certainly be found. So he quickly opened Google Maps. He didn't have time to plan a route. He just needed to know one thing. Which direction is the next village? He quickly found the direction and started walking through the forest. And then, his phone died. Fortunately, when people travel abroad, there are usually 3 things they never leave behind: their phone, their passport, and their wallet. He knew going back to the ryokan was impossible. He had to keep running, but he was losing a lot of blood, so he took off his windbreaker and tightly wrapped it around his injured thigh to try to stop the bleeding. Then he began dragging his injured leg behind him as he walked. He couldn't tell whether it was real or simply his fear playing tricks on him, but he could hear loud voices coming from the direction of the village. It sounded like someone was still searching for him. Fortunately, the place he had escaped into was not a normal forest where people would casually go hiking. He had forced his way into an almost impossible, inaccessible part of the mountain simply because he was desperate to survive. And so, for nearly 2.5 hours, he kept moving through the mountain. Eventually, he made it across, and when he finally emerged on the other side, he saw something unexpected: a small bus stop. He had no idea whether the bus still ran there, or whether the bus stop was even still in use. But at that moment, it was the first sign of civilization he had seen since escaping. So he decided to hide there and wait for a bus. He had no idea whether there was even a last bus at that hour. His phone was dead, and all he had left was a small amount of cash and his passport. But there was no other option. His leg was barely functioning, and he knew he couldn't walk any farther. So he thought, if a bus comes, I'll get on it. I don't care how long I have to wait. I'll hide here until one comes, and then I'll take it to a larger town. But even while he was waiting, Dolby was terrified. He had made it this far by forcing his way through mountain trails, and Japan, unlike Korea, has a lot of wild animals. There are even wild bears in Japan, so he was afraid of everything. What if a wild animal appears? What if the people from the village find me? All of those fears were running through his mind at once. He was breathing heavily and trembling uncontrollably, even though he was in severe pain. Then, after about 30 or 40 minutes, a bus finally arrived. He got on immediately, and the only Japanese word he could manage to say was, Jukete, help me. You've probably heard that word countless times in anime. That was the one Japanese word Dolby knew. The moment he said, Tasukite, the bus driver immediately realized that something was seriously wrong. Fortunately, there was no one else on the bus. The driver looked at him and understood that he was in trouble. As it turned out, the bus was heading directly toward a larger town. After driving for about 30 minutes from the rural village, the bus arrived in a more developed area, and the driver took Dolby directly to the police station. The bus driver dropped him off near the police station. It wasn't actually a designated bus stop, but the driver apparently told him, "Just get off here." So Dolby got off and went into the police station. Since he couldn't speak Japanese, he tried to communicate by pointing at his phone and saying things like, "Battery, no battery," and "Itai, itai." "It hurts, it hurts." He could only speak a few broken Japanese words. Fortunately, the police understood that something serious had happened. They took him to a hospital where his wound was stitched up and he was given antibiotics. But the police officers who accompanied him quickly realized something. This wasn't a normal injury. It was a stab wound. And because of that, the Japanese police had to investigate the incident, even though he was a Korean citizen. 2 police officers accompanied him. Fortunately, there was a doctor at the hospital who could speak Korean. With the doctor's help, Dolby was able to explain everything. He told them that he had gone to a certain village where something terrible had happened to him. He hadn't simply been robbed. He had felt that his life was in danger. And he had escaped because he believed he might die if he stayed there. He reported everything. But after making the report, Dolby didn't want to stay in Japan any longer. He just wanted to get out. So the very next day, after making his report, he returned to Korea. Once he was safely back in Korea, he turned on his phone. And then he discovered something terrifying. Every single one of Sakura's social media accounts had disappeared. All of them. He knew where the village was. He had already reported what had happened. And he had left his contact information with the Japanese police so they could contact him if there were any developments. But for now, he just wanted to go home. So he returned to Korea. Then, about 3 days later, he received a call from the Japanese police. They found the place where Sakura had been staying, and when they arrived at the scene, they told Dolby that Sakura was already dead. Dolby was informed that Sakura had died. For him, the whole situation had been absolutely terrifying. But at the same time, he thought, "At least there's no one left who can come after me. Thank God." So he eventually began telling some of his friends what had happened. While he was telling the story, one of Dolby's closest friends, a Korean-Japanese friend, suddenly asked him, "Wait, was this somewhere in that particular region?" Dolby was stunned. "How do you know that?" "Yes, that's right. It was in that area, south of the city." Then his friend said, "Ah, then it might be what I think it is." And he began telling Dolby something he knew. From this point on, what I'm about to tell you is based entirely on what that Korean-Japanese friend explained. I don't know for certain whether everything he said was true. According to him, Japan has an enormous number of shrines, and each shrine is dedicated to different gods or spirits. Every shrine has its own deity that it worships. Unlike in Korea, where people generally worship well-known, established deities, there are shrines in Japan that deify specific individuals or beings and worship them as gods. Some shrines are even dedicated to war deities, people who were worshipped as gods because of their achievements in ancient wars. According to my friend, in the region where this happened, there are places where people who played a major role in wars against Korea long ago were deified and worshipped. And according to the story, the shrine maidens who serve those shrines believe something truly horrifying. If something bad happens to their village, or if misfortune continues to plague the community, they believe they must offer a Korean person as a sacrifice to their god. They believe that by doing so, the god will once again protect their village. But there are also supposedly regions where people believe that if they fail to provide the sacrifice, one of their own must become the sacrifice instead. Only then, they believe, will the village be spared from the god's wrath. So my friend told Dolby that Sakura's death might have been one of 2 things. Either Sakura had chosen to become the sacrifice because she had failed to provide one, or the people of that region had sacrificed the shrine maiden herself. And according to him, the local police probably knew about the story too, because, he said, that particular region was actually famous for something like this.